Hi, friends, and welcome back to The Objective Hindu. I'm launching a new show today, and it's called As I Please. As I Please is a phrase that I've borrowed from the famous English writer George Orwell. He used to write a column during the days of the World War where he voiced his opinion on various subjects, and that column was called As I Please. And so I thought it would be an apt phrase for me to use as I intend to also do the same, which is to voice my opinions on the subjects that are pertinent today, as well as propound some ideas that I've come up with, which might be either different or, at least from what I know, fairly unique. And the first one today is indeed something that I think is fairly unique. I want to talk about Ukraine and Russia and Pakistan and India. And I know the first reaction you might have is, what does Pakistan and India have to do with Ukraine and Russia? And no, it's not about buying oil, etc. I have been thinking deeply about this topic, and of course, as you all know, I follow geopolitics very closely. And while there's a lot to be said in terms of the actual war and Putin and Zelensky and Trump, etc., and maybe we will on a different day, today I actually want to draw some very interesting parallels between Ukraine and Pakistan. Countries that are seemingly divided by geography and have very little in common, at least on the face of it. But I think in the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, and this will be a slightly longish sort of opinion piece, because I'm going to try and cover everything in one sort of go rather than make multiple videos. It's just too much work. But I think in the next 20 to 30 minutes, I expect that you will have a slightly different view potentially on this whole topic, and maybe you will see the same parallels that I do between Pakistan and Ukraine, especially in their relationships with the West, their geopolitical sort of importance, the role that Russia's played in both these states, or the creation of both these states, their historical linkages to their so-called sort of mother civilizations, whether Russia in Ukraine's case or India in Pakistan's case, and more. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to go into the history of Pakistan, which I do have a fair bit of expertise on, and maybe I'll do that in depth in a different video. But it would suffice to say that Pakistan, as it stands today, remember there used to be West and East Pakistan. Today, East Pakistan is called Bangladesh, and West Pakistan is obviously called Pakistan. But both these parts of the erstwhile sort of British Indian territories were very integral to the Indian story. So they were both, obviously partitioned for a number of reasons. But just to set the context, they were both key to India, and in fact, even the name India has a direct connection with the river Indus, most of which today actually flows in Pakistan. So you can argue that the Indian story is incomplete without the Indus, as has in fact often been argued. So Pakistan was created in 1947, and of course there's a long story as to how it ended up. But the point to be noted here is that it was created by an act of the British Parliament, and since then it has been consistently an ally of the West. In fact, a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Now hold that thought, and what I want to do next is explore Ukraine's history, which is perhaps not as well understood, and certainly not something that I knew of as intuitively either. And I've spent some time just documenting key highlights from the Ukrainian history. And then once we've gone through that, I'd love to then actually talk about the actual sort of the case that I'm making, that if you actually lay these two on the table, you'll see that there are parallels between them, and they're very, very unique, and very, in some ways, they're very surprising, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I want to talk briefly about Ukraine and Ukraine's history, and while this is not about Ukraine's history in entirety, but I just want to talk about how the sort of Ukrainian national consciousness has evolved, and why Ukraine at least appears to be an independent country today. It is an independent country, by law, of course, but also from an identity perspective. So firstly, the story actually goes back to the 9th century, when the Kievan Rus, an Eastern Slavic tribe people, settled down in what's Kiev, as the name suggests, which is the capital of Ukraine today, that area. And you can see that the word Rus is actually what goes on to become Russia or Russia. So that's the origin of that entire people. Now, when did the center of power move from Kiev to Moscow? Well, it actually moved pretty early, I think in the 11th century or 12th century, the Mongols, as they have in many other parts of the world, invaded and destroyed and sacked Kiev, and people ran helter skelter, and the Kievan Rus actually moved further east and settled down, and then later established the city of Moscow and the state of Russia or Russia. During this time, the what is today Ukraine, especially the western part of Ukraine, was actually occupied. You can say occupied, but was under the influence of both the Lithuanians and the Poles, who are also Slavic people, but of course have slightly distinct identities today to what the Russians might be considered to be. So that brings us to, I think, the 17th century or something, and then of course there's a Russian influence. So this is when Russia as a state becomes quite powerful under the Tsars, and so there's a Russianification of Ukraine, or you can argue a re-Russianification of Ukraine, and this extends to to military and to culture and to language and of course religion, which till very recently was absolutely a unifying factor amongst the two, and I'll touch on that in a second. And then of course in the more modern history, the USSR obviously breaks down in 1991. Ukraine is actually a founding member of the USSR, interestingly. So they were very much part of that Soviet bloc. The point I wish to stress is that the Soviet bloc had all kinds of people, right? They had the Kazakhs, they had the Azerbaijanis, etc. Not all of them were as convinced about the idea. I mean, they were basically annexed. But I would say Ukraine was not necessarily one of them. I think Ukraine was very much on board. Maybe not so much with the Soviet idea, but I mean, they did not ever see themselves, certainly not back in the day, in the 1920s, they never saw themselves as any different to the Russians per se, as they increasingly do today. So that then leads to the Soviet Union. That era, 1991, the Soviet Union breaks down. As you know, Ukraine becomes an independent country. Russia becomes an independent country. They establish good bilateral relationships, etc. And apparently there have been some guarantees in the past that NATO and the Western world will not arm Ukraine, and actually Russia gives guarantees for Ukraine's security to Ukraine in exchange of Ukraine actually surrendering all its nuclear weapons. Now, you remember, nuclear weapons in Ukraine were basically the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, which were based on the western side of the Soviet Union, which was Ukraine. So the nuclear weapons in Ukraine were basically, to put it simply, they were Russian nuclear weapons, and those were surrendered by the modern state of Ukraine, partially on assurances from Russia. This story then continues, and it leads to other more recent sort of crises and key events, including the elections where there was a pro-Russian president. I think his name was Yushchenko, who was elected, and then it was argued that election was stolen, and there were street protests, and I think America had a role to play as well. And then his rival candidate, who was much more in quotes pro-West, was elected. In fact, I've got his name written down here. So the original guy was Yanukovych. So he was the sort of pro-Russian person, and then he was deposed, and Yushchenko was elected. He's the more pro-West person. And then Yanukovych actually came back for some time, and so there was a little bit of a, the elections actually reflected the national consciousness to some extent, because essentially people were voting on whether they want to go more towards Russia versus towards, in quotes, the West. Zelensky belongs to the camp of the Yushchenko camp, so the more Western aligned camp. Now, so that's a very brief sort of timeline. A couple of key events that I want to talk about. One is that in 1918, Ukraine actually established its own church, the UOC, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as a separate church from the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, remember, these are all part of the Eastern Orthodoxy, which both the Ukrainians and the Russians are, as well as some of the others, including Greeks, are. In fact, there are 3 seats of temporal power in the Eastern Orthodoxy: Greece, one in Greece, one in Constantinople, in now what is Turkey, and the third one in Moscow and Russia. And interestingly, 9% of Ukrainians they actually follow Greek Orthodoxy, so neither Russian nor Ukrainian Orthodoxy. And this is very significant because these 9% are actually on the west of Ukraine. And as I'll demonstrate in a second, a lot of the splits that we see within, and the clefts that we see within Ukraine today actually are very much on the fault lines that are established by factors such as the religious divide. So 1918 UOC, Ukraine Orthodox Church, is established, but it was never accepted by the Russians, and to be honest, it was never really very influential in Ukraine either. So till recently, I would say till 2019 in particular, the all major churches, the Eastern Orthodox churches in Ukraine, were very much aligned to the patriarch in Moscow. And of course, the patriarch in Moscow, you can argue, is aligned to the Russian state. So there was a very strong indirect influence. And this is a key point to keep in mind when I actually draw those parallels with Pakistan. So I'll come back to this. So in 2019, the UOC actually declared its independence from the ROC, from the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, Russia never agreed to this, neither did the ROC patriarch. But interestingly, the Greek patriarch, the Greek Orthodox Church, actually accepted it. So now the Greek Orthodoxy, the 9%, and the Ukrainian Orthodoxy have become sort of one unit. And the Russian Orthodoxy, at least up till this recent war, was the second sort of unit. These lines are now blurring because the process of de-Russianification or de-Russification, as evidenced by many things, but most importantly the adherence to the UOC instead of the ROC, has accelerated post the Russian sort of war and the invasion of Ukraine. So that's a crash course on sort of key events. There's obviously a lot more, but this I think tells you a little bit about how we got to where we are in terms of Ukraine. Again, I'm not talking about the war per se and why they invaded, etc. But this is, I think, a good time for us to start drawing some parallels where I will then briefly talk about Pakistan in an attempt to draw those parallels, and hopefully you'll start to see that picture emerge through nice and clear. So the first one is both Ukraine and Pakistan have a strategic geopolitical location. They have a geopolitical advantage, not an advantage, but they have a geopolitical significance both from a land perspective and a sea perspective. In the case of Ukraine, Ukraine has always been a little bit of the buffer state. It's been on the western end of Russia and on the eastern end of Europe. And so it's even as recently as the First and Second World Wars, during which Russia actually was fighting on the side of the Allies, funnily. It was actually Ukraine, or you can say that part of Russia, that actually bore most of the brunt. And even if you go back further in history, when I was talking about the Mongols and the Lithuanians and the Poles, etc., it was exactly that particular region of, let's say, Western Russia or Eastern Europe that saw the conflicts and often bore the consequences of fighting. Whoever controlled that region usually was seen to have the upper hand on as far as the other side was concerned. The same is the case with Pakistan, right? Pakistan is geopolitically significant because it divides the great Indian subcontinent from Central Asia and the Middle East. Without Pakistan, for example, India cannot have a direct border with Iran. Without Pakistan, India cannot have a direct border with Afghanistan, which historically it did with both those countries. And this is very significant from another point of view, which is the energy security. I'll come to that in a second. And the other angle is, of course, the sea angle. In case of Ukraine, Russia cannot control the Black Sea, and actually did not control the Black Sea till 2014 because that access got sort of absorbed with the formation of Ukraine because that's where the access is from. And Russia then invaded, I think you probably heard of this, the Crimea, which is a region of Ukraine, in 2014. And that was exactly because Russia wanted access to the Black Sea and they've stationed a fleet there. Now, in case of Pakistan, the port of Gwadar, which is in present-day Balochistan within Pakistan, which was funnily not even part of Pakistan to begin with. But that's also an area of strategic significance. And as some of you might know, China has been investing a lot in building that port. They recently actually built a new airport in Gwadar as well, although no one flies there. But it's of strategic importance because it's right on the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It's close to Iran, it's close to Yemen, it's close to Dubai. And so you can argue that India also has the same interests in that area. Obviously, India does not control it, unlike Russia, which does control Crimea and the Black Sea today. But going back to the point that I was making, both these countries have very significant geopolitical locations, and whoever has a good relation with these countries or allies with these countries tends to benefit. And I'll come to who those are in a second. Now, the second parallel I want to draw is one of energy security and agriculture, actually food and energy both. Both Ukraine and Pakistan, or just roughly the northwest of India, were the wheat baskets of, in the former's case, Europe and Russia, and in the latter's case, the Indian subcontinent. Most of the agricultural production of British India happened in essentially in the Punjab area, and some other parts of northwest India, Sindh, Punjab, and some parts which are presently in India. Same thing in Russia. Most of Russia's grain was from Ukraine. In fact, as you all know, this war has actually pushed up the global prices of food, and one of the reasons is that there's a shortage of food in Ukraine, which tends to feed a lot of Europe. Even till date. So that's the agricultural side, and there's also the energy security side. Now, because Russia is an energy surplus country, Ukraine, whoever controls Ukraine, controls the relationship Western Europe, or the rest of Europe, actually Central Europe more accurately, and then Western Europe, has with Russia. Because, of course, all the oil pipelines, etc., pass through Ukraine. Now, same thing happens when it comes to Pakistan. Now, India is an energy scarce country. But without Pakistan's approval, and which we don't get very easily for many reasons, India struggles to actually secure energy from countries like Iran or other Central Asian states, because there's no direct either land or sea link that India can exploit. And India is obviously reluctant to build a pipeline over Pakistan because there are security concerns there. So this means that in India's case, whoever wants to put India on the back foot will be interested in ensuring that Pakistan remains the way it is, and this prevents India from having energy, not independence, but from having a much more wider pool of resources available to choose from when it comes to energy. So that, I think, is another very interesting parallel between the two countries. The third one is actually the cultural significance of both Ukraine and Pakistan to their respective sort of motherlands, if you want to call it that, or the civilizational sort of motherlands. As I described, the Russian story actually began in what is today Ukraine, right, with the Kievan Rus in the 9th century. Well, so did the Indian story. Remember, I talked about the river Indus, and the most of the civilization of the Indian subcontinent traces its origin, and certainly its heyday, in the Indus Valley, which is mostly in Pakistan. Some parts are in India of the Indus Valley civilization, but the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, dating back to around 2000 to 2500 BC, and extremely evolved states for back then, are all today in the state of Pakistan. So the Indian the most important texts, the Vedas for the Hindus, and much of the India's literature also actually originated from that particular part of what was northwest India. Ukraine has a similar story, and now, while I don't claim that there were the same sort of religious books written there, and that's because, both Russia and Ukraine became Christian, Ukraine's contribution to linguistics, to poetry, to art, etc., to music as well, have been equally significant in the sort of Russian story. So, if you look at Russia from a cultural perspective, minus Ukraine, Russia appears to be much poorer, as does India, without Pakistan. So that's, I think, another interesting area for us to look at. And the fact that both Pakistan and Ukraine have been, for many reasons, split from their sort of mothership weakens the cultural narrative in both those sort of so-called mothership countries, in this case, Russia and India. Now, the next one is a more difficult and nuanced one to appreciate, and that's the religious split and the role that the religious split has played in both the creation, sustenance, and the continuous destabilization of both these countries, Pakistan and Ukraine. So I talked about the fact that the Ukrainian church attempted to secede in 1918, and of course in 2019 they actually, in quotes, became independent. So it's a 100-year journey. It's around the same time that in India there was the rise of some sort of Muslim consciousness. And while it's not quite the same, because of course the Indians at large were not under one church. Muslims were always Muslims, and the non-Muslims were always non-Muslims in the sense of 1918. the split still has some parallels because the rise of the Ukrainian consciousness is tied to the Ukrainian Christian identity as being separate from the Russian Christian identity. And the rise of Muslim nationalism in India, which led to Pakistan, or at least partially led to the creation of Pakistan, is also based on the same idea of a split, which was famously called the two-nation theory, which propounded that Muslims of India are a different people and a different nation from the Hindus of India or the non-Muslims of India. So this split, while it has taken different flavors, and of course there are different religions involved here, has also been a big factor that led to the creation and on the basis of which the national identity of both those present day states actually stands today. If you remove the Islamic doctrines and the idea of a two-nation theory from the Pakistan narrative, Pakistan will collapse. It will collapse in some other ways as well, but this is one of the it's one of the sort of bulwarks that holds it together. And the same thing, Ukrainian national identity never was a national identity, at least not in the sort of present form, until the UOC began to become more powerful and started to ally more with the Greek Orthodoxy rather than the Russian Orthodoxy. Now let's talk about NATO and the role of West from a military perspective. So I'm sure some of you know that the Ukraine was close to discussing negotiations it was close to negotiating NATO membership with the West, and this was something that Russia, rightly or wrongly, thought of as a red line, and obviously the war is at least partially a result of that, in my opinion. But did you all know that Pakistan, while not a NATO ally, and of course NATO cannot be, no one in Asia is a NATO ally because it's about the North Atlantic, which is nowhere close to where we are in India and Pakistan. But did you know that Pakistan is what's called a major non-NATO ally? So think about this: Ukraine is an ally and close to being a NATO ally, which is the sort of supreme military alliance of the West, and Pakistan, while it cannot become a NATO ally for the reasons that I just mentioned, is actually designated as a major non-NATO ally. So both these countries have the same support from the West from a military perspective. The same extends today when it comes to the wars in Ukraine. All the wars that Ukraine's today fighting and has fought in the last decade or so has been fought using primarily American machinery. All the wars that Pakistan has fought with India have also been fought using American technology. Of course, they lost all the wars despite having that advantage. But it's not a coincidence that in both the cases, the support for both Pakistan and Ukraine has come from the West, and both are intrinsically linked to the NATO conversation. Both are also, very interestingly, buffer states that were created or have been supported as some sort of a guard against Russia and Russian expansion. So Ukraine is very obvious, and I've talked about that already in terms of how it's on the sort of western frontier of Russia, and whoever controls Ukraine has a little bit of an advantage. And by the way, when I was mentioning the nukes as well in the first part, in an earlier part, it was the same idea. That's why Russia had nukes in Ukraine, because that was the extent of the Russian sort of influence back then, and the territory that they controlled, and that's where they had positioned their nukes. So it was like this sort of buffer state that they had created, or a buffer region within their state, to be more accurate. Now, with Pakistan, and this is not very well known, Pakistan was also created. Maybe annoying for the Muslims to know about this, because they think that Muhammad Ali Jinnah created it. No, he did not. The British created it. The British created it and used him as a useful idiot in the process, specifically as a buffer state to ensure military security of the Indian subcontinent. But military security against who is the question? Military security against the Soviets and Russia, who by then were already in Afghanistan. And one of the sort of fears that the British had, maybe even a legitimate fear, was that if Russia and India can share a land border, which arguably they would if Russians were in Afghanistan and India was not divided, then it would be a big problem for the British Empire. So both Ukraine and Pakistan have been created and or at least supported as buffer states to counter the Russian influence with India in the case of the Indian subcontinent, and obviously the modern state of Russia in the case of USSR, Russia and Ukraine in the northern Eurasian context. There is also another sort of parallel there, that there are internal divides, religious and linguistic divides in Ukraine and Pakistan, that lead to fault lines in those modern states. That's also very similar. So, for example, in Pakistan, the eastern part of Pakistan, so that's Punjab and Sindh, which essentially borders what is present day India, is very, in quotes, India-like. It's exactly the same language, exactly the same food, etc. Although they try very hard to be slightly different with their accents and their clothes, etc. But basically, it's fundamentally the same sort of culture and same people from a genetic perspective as well, if one bothers to look at that evidence. In the case of the western parts of Pakistan, though, which would be the northwest frontier province, which borders Afghanistan, and Baluchistan, which borders Iran, it's a different story. Those people are different, and they share some DNA with the Indians, the Northwest Indians, and some with Central Asians in the case of Afghanistan, or some with Iranians in the case of Baluchis, and also actually some Arab DNA in their case. So this is where there's a little bit of a split and there's a cleft. And that's why those areas within the modern state of Pakistan are restive and have a different opinion on Pakistan. It happens to be that they don't have a favorable opinion, but what's important is that they have a different opinion. In the case of Ukraine, when I mentioned the Greek Orthodox adherents of the 9% of Ukrainians, they're all on the West. And they see themselves very much part of the Western world and not part of the Russian world. And it's not a coincidence that they don't, because they are not aligned to the Russian church. Their language is slightly different, and they have historically, of course, been geographically closer to the border with Central Europe. Similarly, people who are in the sort of central parts of Ukraine, which were historically ruled and influenced for at least a period of time by the Lithuanians and the Poles, are also still today influenced by those parts of Europe. And there's a cleft, there's a split that you see there. And therefore, if today, if you ask, maybe discount this recent war, but if you happen to ask a Ukrainian from the east of Ukraine what they think about Russia, they would, they would usually have a favorable view and not consider themselves to be very different. But if you ask someone from the west of Ukraine, they would consider themselves to be far more different. Now, in Pakistan's case, it's exactly the same, albeit with one small difference, is that if you ask someone in Pakistani Punjab about India, several of them would say that they're different, but that would be an artificial difference that they've been force-fed to believe. And there's actually no fundamental basis for those differences. But if you went to the western part of Pakistan, there people will not only believe there's a difference, there is actually a legitimate difference. And that difference then leads to a different approach on nationalism and sub-identities, and their views on the state of Pakistan also as a result differ. The last 2 points I want to make is that both these states, in my opinion, which I've hopefully described in some detail now, they've been, you can say they've been artificially created, or they've been created but artificially sustained. And this shows in their institutions and how weak they are. Both Ukraine and Pakistan, maybe not to the same extent, are corrupt. They're unstable. Elections are rigged. Armies have excessive power. And while they might be democracies on paper, they're far from it. Now, is India a perfect democracy? Of course not. Russia certainly isn't one, but the focus is not so much on India and Russia. The focus is on Pakistan and Ukraine in this case, and both are increasingly unstable. And I think one of the reasons for that instability is that because they've been artificially created, and anything that lacks a basic sort of governing ideology, which I've described has been a challenge for both these countries, will face this problem. And I think the reason that they survive is primarily because they have both Western military support and financial support. Both, by the way, are major recipients of Western, aka United States, financial aid as well. I've already talked about weapons, etc. But it's not just weapons. Both Pakistan and Ukraine get a lot of actual money from America, which is one of the things that Trump is trying to question and challenge, right? Because he's looking at the money that America is paying to Ukraine and is wondering, why are we paying that? And that's, of course, a different conversation. But this is the same story in Pakistan. The day America and World Bank stop funding Pakistan, Pakistan will disintegrate. It's only because of that and the military support that they've got over the years from them is this country still in power. And the same would apply to Ukraine. And the last thing I would say, and this goes back to that whole buffer state idea, is that both these countries have had a strong and sort of long-rooted military tradition. And so again, it's not a coincidence that these happen to become militarized buffer states supported by the West. Northwest of India, Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, etc., even today is known to have some of the sort of most significant units or regiments in the Indian Army. But even going back to World War I and World War II, they had major roles to play in the Allied victories in both those wars, because the British Army was essentially a third of the British Army was Indian, if you included the undivided India, and I'd say 50 to 60% of that third actually came from the region which is today Pakistan. The same applies to Russia and Ukraine as well. So when Russia was fighting the First and the Second World War, in both cases on the sides of the Allies, A, based on the location, and B, based on the traditions, a lot of the actual military manpower and logistical support, and also bearing the brunt of those casualties, happened in what is today Ukraine. So there's a deep-rooted sort of contribution from a military perspective that is also common between these two states. And in my opinion, there's a reason why, therefore, these two states remain financially and militarily dependent on the West and are being used as buffer states, which survive on Western influence, supported by splits in ideology and artificial identities, allowing the West in this case to exercise their power, and maybe legitimately. I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, but the idea of this video is, of course, to talk about how they share so much in common, even though on paper, geographically, historically, linguistically, they are obviously as far as you can imagine two states to be from each other. All right, so I've thrown a lot at you. I hope you enjoyed this sort of first introductory opening episode, number 1 of As I Please. And if you did like the video, please do share it and let me know what you thought through the comments. I will at some stage do another video with some commentary on the actual Russia-Ukraine war, as well as the recent meeting of Zelensky with President Trump, which has been in the news. But until then, thank you for joining, and goodbye.